Welcome, friends, to another deep dive into the complex web of global geopolitics. Often, pivotal historical events receive little or no attention in mainstream discourse, particularly within the United States. Today, I want to take you back to the year 1960. This was an exceptionally critical year in the history of much of the world, but it was particularly transformative for the continent of Africa. In 1960, the powerful waves of anti-colonial revolutions that had been sweeping across Africa reached a critical nexus, the Congo. This period marked a monumental struggle for self-determination, a fierce rejection of centuries of exploitation, and a bold assertion of sovereignty that fundamentally altered the global geopolitical landscape. The Congo was, and arguably remains, the richest part of an already extraordinarily resource-rich continent. Yet, this vast wealth became a curse under the brutal yoke of colonial rule. The tariffs would be lowered if and only if the European nations agreed to drastically alter their energy procurement strategies. Specifically, they were coerced into purchasing significantly more expensive liquefied natural gas exported directly from the United States, effectively subsidizing the American energy sector. Furthermore, Europe was pressured to commit hundreds of billions of dollars in direct investments into the U.S. economy. This was not diplomacy, it was extortion, an explicit demand that Europe pay a heavy financial price simply to maintain access to American markets and avoid further economic punishment. This blatant economic coercion strained the transatlantic marriage to its absolute breaking point, to put it mildly. The imposition of tariffs and the subsequent demands for economic tribute did not occur in a vacuum. They followed closely on the heels of another major strategic shock. The United States had already begun to sharply reduce its financial and military support for the ongoing war in Ukraine. This sudden withdrawal of commitment deeply unsettled European capitals, stimulating bitter recriminations and a profound sense of betrayal. Europe had heavily invested its own resources and political capital into the Ukraine conflict, largely under the assumption of unwavering American leadership. The sudden shift in U.S. priorities left Europe dangerously exposed, forcing them to reevaluate the reliability of their primary security guarantor and accelerating the urgent need for strategic autonomy independent of Washington's erratic dictates. Yet, despite the economic extortion, the diplomatic insults, and the strategic abandonment in Ukraine, the European political establishment initially attempted to maintain the facade of unity. They still clung to the deeply ingrained belief that their ultimate political salvation lay in maintaining the transatlantic bond. It is crucial to understand the ideological composition of these leading European groups. We are currently observing a period dominated by highly conservative, right-wing political leadership across much of the continent, with only a few notable exceptions. For these ruling factions, their primary political strategy for maintaining domestic control relied heavily on perpetuating a climate of external threat. They firmly believed that their best hope for survival was to continuously demonize Russia, effectively keeping the ideological architecture of the Cold War alive or actively working to reimplant a modern version of it. The irony of this strategy is profound. The European leadership relentlessly demonized a nation that had long since abandoned its Soviet-era ideology. They chose to ignore the glaring reality that modern Russia has fully embraced global capitalism and decisively rejected the socialist model of the past. This fundamental shift in economic and political structure was a detail that the European establishment conveniently chose not to notice, as acknowledging it would undermine their narrative of an existential ideological threat. By maintaining the specter of a hostile, expansionist Russia, these governments could justify their continued subservience to the United States and distract their domestic populations from growing internal crises. They desperately needed an external enemy to justify their policies, even if that required perpetuating a deeply flawed and historically outdated geopolitical framework that ultimately harmed their own national interests. And from a purely cynical, domestic, political perspective, one can understand their desperation. Every single one of these major European governments is currently facing historically low approval ratings and profound unpopularity. The political landscape across Europe is highly volatile. Take France as a prime example. In recent municipal elections, the ruling party of the incumbent president was virtually obliterated. The political center is collapsing, squeezed relentlessly by a surging, mobilized left-wing movement demanding economic justice and a rapidly rising nationalist right-wing capitalizing on anti-establishment anger. The days of the current centrist establishment are clearly numbered. They are operating in a state of perpetual political crisis. How do these deeply unpopular leaders maintain control over a general population that is increasingly furious, economically strained, and utterly disillusioned with the political status quo? The root cause of this widespread public fury is directly linked to the disastrous consequences of Europe's geopolitical alignment. Everything the European establishment has done to appease the United States, particularly their aggressive posture and extensive sanctions regime surrounding the early years of the Ukraine war, has cost the European populace dearly. By unquestioningly following Washington's lead and severely sanctioning Russian energy exports, the lifeblood of the European industrial engine, they inflicted a massive, self-inflicted wound on their own economies. Energy prices across the continent skyrocketed, often tripling in a matter of months. They were forced to replace cheap, reliable piped gas from the East with vastly more expensive imported liquefied natural gas from the United States, fundamentally destroying the competitive advantage that had underpinned European industrial prosperity for decades. The devastating ripple effects of these soaring energy costs permeated every sector of the European economy. When industrial energy costs triple, the fundamental mathematics of manufacturing are destroyed. It meant exponentially higher production costs for absolutely everything Europe produces, from heavy machinery to consumer goods. Consequently, European exports became drastically uncompetitive on the global market. The rest of the world logically stopped buying overpriced European products, shifting their supply chains toward far more cost-effective alternatives, primarily heavily subsidized goods from China or even from the United States itself. Europe's industrial base began to hollow out, its economic influence rapidly fading. The continent was descending into a state of profound economic desperation, driven entirely by geopolitical decisions made to satisfy an alliance that no longer served its fundamental interests. Faced with this catastrophic economic decline and a mass populace rapidly turning against them, the right-wing and centrist political establishment employed a desperate strategy of distraction. They attempted to hold on to power by perpetuating the illusion that they were the vital defenders saving their nations from an imminent existential threat posed by a demonized adversary. They continuously amplified the narrative that a hostile invasion of the rest of Europe was a genuine possibility, a fear tactic designed to enforce domestic unity. Furthermore, they constantly sought to project an image of a robust, unbreakable alliance with the United States, presenting themselves as indispensable partners in a global struggle. The U.S. administration cleverly and ruthlessly exploited this deep-seated European insecurity, utilizing their desperation to force them into accepting highly disadvantageous economic and strategic concessions at almost every turn. However, this delicate and highly exploitative geopolitical game has finally been pushed one step too far. The decision by the United States leadership, acting in close coordination with Israel, but notably excluding any meaningful consultation with Europe, to initiate a military conflict with Iran was the breaking point. The U.S. administration did not even extend the basic diplomatic courtesy of informing its European allies before embarking on this highly volatile path. And then, after unilaterally igniting a regional crisis, Washington demanded that European nations, already reeling from severe economic hardship and profound political instability, step up and incur the massive political, financial, and military costs required to act as junior partners in this deeply flawed venture. They were asked to bleed for a war they fundamentally do not understand, absolutely do not want, and critically cannot physically or economically afford to fight. The sheer audacity of the American demand exposed the utter disconnect between Washington's ambitions and Europe's grim reality. European nations are barely managing to sustain their existing commitments. Their resources are dangerously depleted by the ongoing and increasingly disastrous proxy conflict in Eastern Europe. To be brutally honest about the strategic situation, the Western Alliance is failing to achieve its objectives in that theater. The absolute last thing Europe needs or can tolerate is being dragged into another massive, open-ended conflict in the Middle East a war that carries an extremely high probability of catastrophic failure and further economic ruin. Therefore, driven by sheer self-preservation, they finally found the collective resolve to say no. This definitive refusal marks a watershed moment in modern history. The United States now finds itself strategically isolated on the global stage, its demands ignored by its most crucial traditional partners. So, the architecture of international alliances has fundamentally shifted. The United States is now acting almost entirely alone in this endeavor. What is the ultimate cost of this aggressive unilateral war? It is profound and systemic isolation. Europe has now internalized, in the most dramatic and painful way possible, that the era of a mutually beneficial transatlantic partnership is definitively over.